This trick I'm about to show you is actually really simple, and it's how I got my Sony A7 III footage up to 240 frames per second. Alright, so let's take a closer look at how I was able to pull this off. Now, of course, the eagle-eyed among you might have been able to notice that the footage wasn't perfect, and of course it wasn't really recording at 240 frames per second. The A7 III I don't think is physically capable of doing that. But inside Davinci Resolve, there's this little feature where you can increase the what's called frame interpolation. And as long as you don't stretch it too far, I think 240 frames per second for 120, or in other words, doubling your frame rate in most cases, as long as you're shooting in the correct shutter speed, I'll talk about that, is kind of the sweet spot. So let me show you what I mean. So what I'm going to do here is, I already have the clips on my timeline here. I'm going to turn my audio down just a little bit so it doesn't do that to you. So basically what I've done here is, if you'll notice, I'll do Control R when I have a clip selected, which is to retime the clip. And I love this feature because you can dynamically retime clips by just grabbing the top corner or other corner and stretching it out, and it'll tell you what percentage of what the speed percentage is for how it's doing that. And you can see that these clips I have set to 10%. I think I have them all set to 10%, if I'm not mistaken. Oh, you can do them all at once too, by the way, just like this. So yeah, I have them all set to 10%. So this footage is 1080p at 120 frames per second at either 1/160th or 1/200th shutter speed, and that's important. And 10% is roughly 240 frames per second, equivalent as far as like the retiming structure. Because when you get 120 frames per second footage and you want to retime it so that it's being played back to you at 24 frames per second in slow motion, that is about 20%-ish, 20 to 23, I think, percent. I don't know the exact math, but it's about 20% as far as playback speed. And it will play back in real time at about 24 frames per second. It'll feed you about 1 frame, or about 24 frames per second, which inherently slows down the footage, right? And that's how you get slow motion. At least that's the best way, in my opinion, because having it slow down in camera reduces the bit rate, and that's a topic for another day. The reason why the shutter speed is important is because if the shutter speed is too sharp, then it might introduce some artifacting in the frame interpolation. But if it's too soft, so if you're if you're 1/120th or 1/100th or whatever the minimum is for 120 frames per second, then it'll look blurry and you'll get more artifacting as well. So you have to make sure that you're shooting the correct shutter speed as well, which of course we all know is double your frame rate, roughly. I typically, when I'm shooting, when you're going with 120 frames per second and above, You don't have to continue to follow that rule up into the 1/400ths or whatever. Normally, usually if you're shooting at that slow of a speed, motion isn't fast enough to introduce like overly blurry footage. So I digress. Okay, so let's take a look. So what I've done is I've put these clips on the timeline and I have retimed them to 10 frames per second. Okay, now let's take this clip of my sister, this first clip here, and I'm going to open up my inspector and let me just select just this one. And I'm going to go to Retime and Scaling. Double click on that to open it up. And you can see here that I've left motion estimation and scaling alone. I left those alone just because it kind of broke my GPU. I'm not running a super high-end GPU. It's just a 1050 Ti, which Davinci Resolve still uses quite well and efficiently, but it's not, it's not a super expensive GPU. But I found that optical flow and bilinear resize filtering, so the retime process to optical flow, which I believe produces a nice smooth effect, and then the resize filter set to bilinear. And basically what that did is that told Davinci Resolve that in between each frame, so instead of just displaying the same frame for 2 frames, the second duplicated frame, it kind of blurred and then placed in between frames 1 and 3, right? So let me just show you a real world example. I can turn off frame interpolation and you can see that it's jumpy, right? So if I full screen this, it's kind of jumpy, right? So when I turn it back on, and of course this will be processing in real time, so it'll be smoother when I export it. But when I, oh, excuse me. Okay, there we go. Okay, when I turn that back on, if I turn the inspector element on here, and I turn the retime and scaling frame interpolation back on, then it smooths it out, right? And it looks really good, honestly. Now, I haven't tested this for 24 frames per second to try to double that to 60 or 60 to 120, but doubling the 120 to 240 seems to work extremely well. And here's my tinfoil hat theory as to why. When you're shooting in high frame rates and you slow it way down, the process of making 120 footage look like 240 footage is much simpler for Davinci Resolve than it would be to make like 24 frames per second footage look like 60 frames per second footage. Because the distance of interpolation between frames is smaller. So Davinci Resolve doesn't have to guess quite as much in between each frame. And so that's why I think this little trick works so well. And it's completely viable and you can use it for anything. You saw in the clips that a lot of even these tricky ones, so this end shot here, you could see a little bit of artifacting, don't get me wrong. So if you look next to the shoes, there's a little bit of like blurriness artifacting. It's not perfect, but it looks really good. If you look at the dress, you can see a little more artifacting, kind of that like blurry, like almost old school slow motion look. But the thing is, look at the trees in the background. They look super good. Like that frame interpolation, those trees look like the wind is affecting them at 240 frames per second. It's really clean. And so that's why I think this method actually works really well. Look at this parallax shot. Let me quickly brighten it up a little bit. I probably should have brightened it up in my here we go. I probably should have brightened it up in my final product, but I was in a hurry. Okay, that looks good, so I'll save the project. Okay, so if I go back to here, check out this one right here, right? This one looks really pretty good. That you can see a little bit of artifacting in the hair and stuff, but the interpolation of the background parallaxing and the edges on the coat of my cousin's coat here and everything, it all looks pretty good. There's no weird like stretching and artifacting with it. It looks great. And this is especially useful if you're working with, a project and you need your clip to just stretch a little further, but you don't want it to be like jumpy, with that like, old school like 90s slow motion, right? Where they would throw something and it would just like, they would just duplicate the frames, right? No, in this case, Davinci Resolve is every duplicated frame is actually being interpolated in between the frame before it and the frame after it to kind of fit in the middle and kind of blur in between. Now, this won't work in every scenario. Like I said, there are some situations where the artifacting gets a little strange, and I'll show you what I mean by that. So in this first clip, I actually couldn't use, let me see here. I think it was right about here. So I couldn't use this first portion of the clip because where the sun started to come over the hair, watch. It kind of, you can see there that it kind of like morphs it a little strangely, and maybe you can't see it on YouTube, but it's something that I noticed. It morphs the hair kind of back a little bit, and it has a bit of weird artifacting, but it's not terrible. So anyway, thanks for watching, you guys. This was kind of a short video, but I really think this is an awesome tool, which is, by the way, in the free version of Davinci Resolve. I don't own the paid version. I might in the future, but I don't own it yet. And this is a sweet feature that they have in here for people, creative filmmakers to be able to utilize, to stretch their shots or just slow them down a little more than they normally would to get that extra cinematic slow motion look. And I personally love slow motion footage. It's amazing. Some people are like, "Oh no, I like to use just 60 or 24 because it's creativity, blah blah blah." No, I think that if you have the option to use ultra slow motion and it benefits your video or your footage or whatever you're putting together, use it. Because it's an amazing tool, and I think you shouldn't not use it, especially for client work. People love that cinematic slow motion look. It looks, they love it. So anyway, thanks again for watching. Remember to like and subscribe for future videos. I plan on making more short tutorials and little tidbits that I find within Davinci Resolve, and just kind of my journey as a filmmaker with my the equipment that I have. So if you're interested in more of that, give this a thumbs up and subscribe for more. Thanks for watching.